Here we are in beautiful Byers Avenue in Hill End, formerly known as Bald Hills, literally the end of the line up here, about 1 hour from Bathurst. And this is an amazing place. It was originally Wiradjuri country, still is. There would have been a few fossickers and rabbiters here, but the really big times in Hill End hit when gold was discovered in New South Wales, officially around 1851. And a few years later, in the early 60s, really big gold was struck here, as well as pan gold further down in the rivers and streams. There was alluvial gold and reef gold, which was the really big one. Massive fortunes were made here. Several thousand people lived in town, and there were 54 pubs. So we're here looking at some of the remaining buildings of Hill End. An enormous amount of gold was taken out of this area. It was both alluvial and reef gold, and those forms of extraction mean that you've got to have long-term works, particularly for the reef gold. It might take months or even years to get down to the seam of gold. So because of that long-term investment, proper town needed to be built with buildings of brick, masonry, wood, wattle and daub. So it's unlike some other gold rush communities which were tent cities, and that's why there's a lot remaining here, and it's super interesting architecturally. So there were about 7,000 people here at the peak. There were dozens of shops, there was an oyster bar, there were of course brothels, there were 50 pubs. Some of them would have just been very sleazy small wine rooms. There were a huge number of nationalities here, of course English speaking people, but there's Irish Hill, Poles, there were French, there were Germans, and there was a huge Chinese community as well. Thousands of Chinese came up by boat, sent mainly in syndicates, and some walked all the way from Sydney, which is just remarkable, isn't it? Camping in Bathurst on the river on the way here. So there would have been a real cacophony of people, and it also would have been a very noisy place. From the 1850s, imported metal stampers, huge machines where people could crush the quartz to extract gold. So a really bustling place, hopefully big dreams, big money, big spending, and lots of fun stories. These landscapes here are really interesting. They look natural, but they're all about the erosion of digging. And you often see artists in the 40s and 50s like Drysdale paint them, and you'd swear they were sort of outback Central Australia or something like that, but they're actually the tailings of the digging at Hill End. Lots of mine shafts and collapse and erosion. So you have to excuse the corrugated iron toilet, which I don't think was there in the past, but this is the famous back view of the rather bald Presbyterian Church built in the 1870s for the Hill End congregation. And artists really liked this view, and it was quite common to paint artist figures standing like isolated figures in a kind of quasi-surrealist landscape in front of this church. You can see those kind of works. They're quite iconic in places like the National Gallery in Canberra. We're standing outside Murray's Cottage on a really nice morning. It's just the beginning of autumn here in Hill End. Murray's Cottage also really could be called Friend's Cottage. It's where Donald Friend lived with his partner for quite a few years. Friend is one of that new wave of artists that rediscovered this town in the 1940s. He came up with Drysdale when Drysdale got a tank of rationed petrol during the war, and they were fed up with Sydney. They were always complaining about the pretension of Sydney. And they went to Sofala first, and they couldn't find anything to buy in Sofala. So they were told to come on to this little town called Hill End. And when they got here, they really intrigued the locals. The locals thought they were from the tax office in Canberra, didn't want to speak to them at first. But they discovered the Royal Hotel down the road with a fabulous cellar full of champagne and 19th century hock from the gold rush days. And then they began to look around at what was available. It was quite hard to get freehold properties. But this is a little typical miner's cottage that Friend acquired in the 40s, I think. And he lived here on and off with his partner. I think the partner became the local bus driver. And Friend went back and forth between Australia and his European, Indian, Balinese trips. And Friend is really interesting, his reflections about Hill End. He called Hill End ready-made surrealism. What did he mean by that? Well, when he came here, it looked very different. National Parks took this over in the 60s, and really they cleaned the town up a lot. But there were a lot of old buildings falling over. They were all at funny angles. They were incongruous. So the artists like Drysdale, like Friend, like his good friend Margaret Olley, who stayed in this cottage many times, they thought this was amazing painting material. There's a great story about Olley staying here in this cottage, which I've lived in twice. It's quite remarkable. It gets so cold here in winter that she used to strap hot water bottles around her middle to go outside and paint during the day. So this is a typical little miner's cottage. There's a central hallway, 2 rooms either side, a more contemporary kitchen out the back, and friend built a special painting studio in the corner for himself. And Olley did a lot of painting. She also designed all this amazing tile work from found objects on the kitchen, which she often painted. And in fact, I think that's another reason why they like this area. They could go out to the old cemetery. There was a Chinese cemetery and a Western cemetery, and they'd find kind of broken objects and bits of statuary falling down, and I suspect they'd bring them back and decorate their gardens. They'd find old metalwork, they'd find old ironwork. And it's this sense of the interaction with the past and with that gold rush period, and then how the town kind of, in a way, went to sleep, that also interested the next generation of artists like Brett Whiteley, who was art school students. They could come up here in the 60s, they would burrow under a house that was covered in blackberries, they'd go up into the house, and they'd claim they'd sometimes find the food laid on the table, like the people had left the house when they abandoned it. So it's a lot of amazing sort of sense of memories of the past that really were great inspirations for their paintings. I don't know whether I should really be sitting on the front step. I believe in summer sometimes there's a red belly black under here, but you know, that's country life. Now, why I love staying in this cottage, Fran and Murray were both really, really keen gardeners. It's late summer, early autumn now, so there's not much flowering, but in spring, all the old bulbs that are 100 years old, the lilac trees, the almond blossom, the fruit trees, they all come to life. And National Parks had actually done a really great archaeological key of exactly what was in the garden, so I used to go out and see what was out, what had come out. I'd try to keep a bit of water up to it. And of course, these are the flowers that appear in Margaret Olley's still lifes and Donald Friend's drawings. So these have been artist cottages for the last 20 years. People come here for short periods of time, about 1 month to 6 weeks. And lots of famous Australian artists and a few writers and poets and the occasional art historian like myself have really benefited from the clarity of thought and the amazing feeling of being in these spaces where people have made art for really nearly 100 years. Washing elegantly displayed on that line. It was a sort of composition. Now, something interesting about these cottages is you never know what kind of secrets they held. So when National Parks took over this house, I guess it would have been the 80s, they went up in the attic and there they discovered many, many batches of the famous Donald Friend diaries, which are illustrated diaries that are now in the National Library, where he recorded the most amazing observations about people, travel situations in the art world with fantastic illustrations, and they were all tucked up there in the attic for safekeeping. Here at the famous Royal Hotel in Hill End, there were dozens of pubs in Hill End in the 19th century, but many of them would have been not as substantial as this one. This was a principal pub, and it was still going when the artists came here in the 40s and 50s. And Donald Friend, who really liked to drink, was very impressed with the cellar. And he also got on very well with the publican, whose name was Gwen, I think. And so he spent a lot of time here and actually concocted this wonderful new sign for the pub, which is exactly as it was done by Friend, but it's been repainted with the head of Queen Victoria. The amazing thing about this town is it's got everything. It's got kind of topography, geography, people, place, history and memory. And so he wrote a book called Hill Endiana, and they had a big festival here in about 1951-52. Here we are in Hill End, outside the residence of Bill Moseley and Genevieve Carroll. They're two of the well-known Hill End artists who came here about 20-25 years ago to rebuild their lives and make their work. And as well as rebuilding their lives, making their work, they also brought to life this beautiful old cottage, which is absolutely delightful, decorated in a really amazing way inside. Hard to replicate, you won't find it in a design magazine. It comes from their imagination. And there's also a beautiful garden around me. It's early autumn now, but in spring and summer it's just like a cascade of roses, and also found objects, sculptures, artworks by both Genevieve and Bill. Hopefully you can come and experience some of this for yourself. Hi everybody, we're here at the studio in Hill End of Genevieve Carroll and Bill Moseley. They arrived in Hill End in about 2005, I think is correct?
Yeah, 2005.
Yeah, so
from Sydney.
You came a little bit after Leno Alvarez.
Yes.
A few years later.
We did.
So he'd done a bit of the pioneering.
He certainly did, yes.
And we're here in your one of your workspaces at your beautiful little it's kind of like a little compound with a series of villas or cottages. And are we in English Lane, or is it called the English Cottages?
It's called the English Cottages, or the English Group, which sounds a bit like a law firm in a way, but it's not. But it was the English family that came up from Tamburra in the gold rush.
I see.
Yeah.
And did you have a pick of several properties from national parks when you arrived here? Or did they say, here you go, guys, would you like the English Group? We
actually met Kim and Lino. They were the first people we met, and they discussed about the cottages available. So we drove around, and we really liked this one because it was just on the perimeter of Hill End. Yeah, so it felt a bit more secluded.
A little bit on the edge of town. Yeah. And you spent many years, gently restoring them. They're full of beautiful kind of your personal effects and things you've collected over the years, and also your work as well. But when you arrived, was it a sort of feeling of elation and real excitement to be in this very distinctive place, or did it have its moments as well?
It was mixed, actually, I would say. It was mixed. I mean, the buildings that we've got here, these gorgeous, little cottages, they literally were falling down, and they were like, there was no garden. It was 3 little cottages, no bathroom, no power, no water.
No power.
So that's all pretty daunting. And they needed major conservation. I wouldn't say restoration, but conservation.
Gentle conserving.
Yeah.
Sort of breathing the life back into them and propping them up gently.
Exactly. And we just felt like, she was like an older woman that didn't need a personality change. So we just thought, let's just conserve her.
Yeah.
Not to make her squeaky clean or,
Yes.
That's irritating to people when they're older, isn't it?
Not to tidy her up too much. And you have Hill End Press, and you're a well-known painter, and Bill's also a well-known photographer and helps run a photography festival here in Hill End called Analog. But were you doing the printing before you came up here, or is that a development that happened in Hill End?
We basically came straight from art school, really. We were at art school, and then in 2007 I was given a residency in Paris at the Cité. So it was a combination of those times that brought us here. Yeah.
And the Hill End Press, you've got a whole lot of amazing old equipment here, and you do special commissions, and you do runs for artists, I assume.
Yeah, we do.
Yes.
We do. We did the late Peter Kingston. We did a beautiful book of his that went off to America. That was like an edition of 6. That was an incredible job to do that. That was great. And it was all on his journey as a young lad to Italy and doing the Piero della Francesca trail.
I see.
So that was a really beautiful, sweet job to be a part of that.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I've always loved your painting. I've been following you for many years. I won't try to characterise exactly what you do, but some of your work is about the interior space, maybe of the mind, as well as the domestic space of the home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that fair enough comment? That it explores interiority, maybe?
It does. I've just read a book recently by Krista Neve called Unquiet Landscape, and that would be like this psychological landscape of interior, like the outside of Hill End, and the interior of myself. So exterior and interior. And then here, I do a lot of walking in the landscape here, and there's all beautiful shards from all broken pots and cups and...
Yeah, all the detritus of the past.
They keep coming up through the earth.
Yep.
So it's almost like I see them as like a memory in the landscape.
Like a memory trace, yeah.
Yeah.
Lino talked to us about, he called it something like the deafness of Hill End, the noises from the past that he can hear but are not actually real at the moment. Yeah, so you're both very interested in this kind of traces, and also how the traces keep reappearing.
You can't help but be affected living here with the weather conditions. It's very, very cold, and the cottages up here, little miners' cottages, you're often not under the one roof as like what we are here. So you're in and out of the weather all the time. So there's that hard drive to work at the acceptance of that.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, and for our viewers, you You have a series of beautiful pavilions. You've got a bathing pavilion, which I expect is a luxury haven for you. And you've got a wonderful separate kitchen, which is an old residence with a wonderful big open fireplace, but also modern gas cooking. And you've got your charming place where you sleep and rest and sit together and read and converse.
Absolutely.
And they're all different. But as you say, in the very cold winter here, and it can be very, very cold still in October here, as you know.
Absolutely.
I used to have to put gloves on to make my coffee in the morning here. Yeah, I know what it's like. But it actually makes you feel, I always feel that kind of thing. You really feel like you're really living, don't you?
It's a conflicting landscape that you're always wrestling to get your head around, because it
can
throws things at you.
It can be quite Edenic, can't it? And a friend wrote in his diary once when he arrived, he said something beautiful like it was a blaze of glory and crops. Because when you've got a good season, you have flowers, you have fruit, people could catch fish in the rivers.
Absolutely.
It's a self-sufficient place as well, to a large degree. Well, thank you so much, Genevieve, for letting us a little bit into your life here, which is a real privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm here with Bill Moseley. He's a very interesting guy luckily I've known him for about a decade. These days we call Bill a multidisciplinary practitioner, but he might have a better way to describe what he does. But a very interesting background because he can make ships. He's been a shipwright in the past.
Yep.
He lived in Sydney on the harbour for a long time, so he was in an aqueous setting. Now he's in this very different inland setting. He works very closely with the Hill End Press, with all sorts of interesting, high-quality, older forms of printing equipment. And he's also really fascinated with photography, with techniques like tintype, ambrotype. And I guess that's a super interesting connection to Hill End and Gulgong in this area, which has that amazing tradition of 19th century studio photography. We've got some of Bill's work and other work behind us in the background. How does living here, how's this happen?
How did we get here?
Exactly.
It was a long and winding path. What am I doing here? Well, the whole thing started back in my early days. I started off as an electrician's apprentice, and then I got a job in a photographic studio, which is really lucky because Antonioni movie Blow Up had just happened, and everybody wanted a job in a photographic studio, but I got one. Then I went on to become a photographer for the Australian Opera Company, so I did all that for quite an Australian ballet. Then I got involved in boat building and ships and did all that sort of thing, so we ran a vintage ferry called Reliance on Sydney Harbour. Then went to art school, it was the year 2000 I think, and we ended up almost instinctively coming to Hill End after National Art School, and here we are. So I was always interested in photography from way back, particularly analogue processes. There's quite a lot of sort of sound concept behind analogue work. I love it. So with that in mind, we started the Hill End Analogue Festival, which was just last November. And we'll be rolling again 2025, and this is the heart of analogue here. We've got analogue all around us. We've got tintype there of Janet Hazard, Jane Barrow, a potter, that's a silver gelatin print. So we're surrounded by analogue photographic and printmaking processes.
Coming here obviously gives you space and certain solitude and frees up some time to work, but what are the other factors about this very interesting landscape and also history of the village and the community that have started to sort of impact ways you think about your own work and work you've been making here?
I feel we're like just scratching the surface of it, Peter. It goes way back, and then there's the Aboriginal history of this place. This whole area figured really strongly in the Aboriginal resistance to the white settlement, particularly taking over the hunting grounds and killing off all the animals, which forced the Aboriginals to eat the sheep. So that led to some misunderstandings there. So anyway, there's a rich history which we're just scratching the surface of. So it's very important, the sense of place.
It's almost like a series of different movies playing in your mind at the same time, because you've got the hardship of the settlers, and some did well, some didn't, some flourished, and you've got the extraordinary, what it must have been like to have the gold rush people here roaming around the streets, either half drunk or fighting or leading fairly decent lives. It's hard to tell from the photographs. There's lots of nice images of domesticity with people sitting in their nicely tended gardens with their nicely dressed children for the photographer. So it's I guess that's something that's fascinating about Hill End, is that we've actually got a lot of visual evidence about what life was like in this town, which makes it quite distinctive.
Yeah, what a stroke of luck that was. A brilliant record of how it was.
Do you feel the town is changing a lot, or is obviously there are new people coming to town all the time? There's some new houses in town, but do you feel that it's still the place you came to 20 years ago, or that there's something?
It's always on the
evolving.
edge. Just the edge keeps shifting. I think it was always on the edge back then. It was on the edge here in the Depression years, and it was still on the edge. But we keep going and we keep creating things.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Bill, for sharing how you feel about living and working in Hill End.
Thanks, Peter.
I'm sitting here at La Paloma Pottery in Hill End with Leno Alvarez, a wonderful person that I'm proud to have known for about 10 years. So Leno, you arrive in Australia, hopefully you thought this is a wonderful country. I think you told me once you were overseas and someone said, go to Australia, there's nothing there. And you thought, okay, that sounds interesting. But you end up in, lo and behold, sort of inner city Newtown. What happened in Newtown that you noticed in the streets that made you think it's time to leave?
Well, there was no longer a bohemian part. It was just sort of like people into real estate, and lawyers buying houses and renovations everywhere.
People with suits and attaché case. And you were renting an old factory there, were you?
Yeah, there was an old factory. The house and the factory came together. We used to pay $240 a week, which was a lot of money then.
So Leno, when you came here, you arrived at a stage when some artists were getting leases on these properties. Did it actually feel romantic and exciting to come to these very simple old miners' cottages? Was it like a kind of really expansive, anything's possible? Or could you also see that it was going to be very challenging?
Well, both things at the same time, but there was actually, we were pioneering this after the other waves of eyes that have been here. We were pioneering, coming and moving here. So, we were quietly working here all the time, moving things and building things.
And I think back then the road wasn't even paved, was it? It wasn't even bitumen. You had to go into Bathurst or Mudgee to buy anything. And what season did you arrive? Was it summer, winter?
We arrived in summer.
Summer.
We arrived in summer of '97, and it's just been 6 years of drought here.
Oh, gee.
So the whole place was brown,
It's completely parched.
Just dust everywhere.
I can imagine.
And then winter came, and it was just this pouring with rain.
Hey, you thought, what have we done?
What have we done? But we thought it was very romantic, all that.
And a lot of people don't realize that potting is a complicated business. People mix clay, you need machinery, you need big kilns. At that stage, were you still mixing your own clay, or were you getting your clay coming in from elsewhere?
No, we had the machines to do it, and we bought, not with us, but when we came here, we turned one of the sheds to be the clay shed, where you can make as much mess as you like, and It's a dusty business, you know. So we bought 30 tons of raw materials
Gee.
because we had a couple of recipes that we can mix ourselves here, because we knew that anything that got transported here was so expensive, you know, so expensive. The way we used to go through clay was like about a ton a week.
Ton a week.
Yeah.
Really?
So-
You were doing these large pot commissions which were being used in big new architectural schemes around the bicentenary and on when Sydney was sort of being redeveloped.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We did a lot of work for a particular building in Darling Harbour, which was built by Merlin International. And we were commissioned to do about 300 really big pots for that particular building.
300.
Yeah, 300, huge.
How many kilns did you have?
And this was in Newtown. We had 2 kilns.
Two.
You know, you can put only 2 pots at a time. So we did that job, you know. It was a very, very good job and put us in the map of a big pot makers, because there was no one in Australia. These people that were commissioned to do the artworks for the building, the name was Public Art Squad, with David Humphreys was the director. They've been looking all over Australia to see who was going to make the pots for the building. Couldn't find anybody in Australia, and they look in the countries that are near Australia, see who may build big pots, you know. There was no one around. So one day there was a guy that crossed the floor in Newtown. He was a photographer. He said, "You made all these things? What do you make them for?" "We don't carry any stock," I say. "We just make them to order, commissions for houses and buildings and stuff." And so he left this guy and went back to base in Ultimo. That's where Public Art Squad was. And said, "David, I find the source of the big pots."
Yeah.
I say, "Where?
I found
Where
them.
are they?" They say, "Just here, 3 kilometers
In the same suburb.
from here." And we got this commission to make this pots. It was a very big job, you know. It took about 4 or 5 months to do it. Only that, you know.
And that period in the 80s was very interesting in Australia because they were doing Parliament House in Canberra. They were really rethinking the country. The country was much more multicultural and diverse by then. There was a bit better funding of the arts. Lots of things were happening. Had you specialised in these large pot commissions when you were training in Mexico? Had that been something that was sort of part of your DNA when you were an artist there?
No, it all became very obvious when I went to Spain. There used to be these 2 families that used to make the biggest pots in the world. And these families used to be commissioned by olive groves and wineries to build these pots to store wine and to store olive oil.
I see.
And I seen them working, these families of, 8, 10 people, sons and daughters and so on. And the potters themselves, they build this, you know, I'm talking about a 3 meters high pot, you know, higher than these huge things. What they used to do is let them in the summer, because they used to build them in summer. And so they dry, and then they build a huge bonfire around them, because there was no kilns that can house pots that big. And the bonfire will fire the pots, you know. They build a big hole in the ground, sort of following the same line and shape of the pots. And they drop the pots in there, and all you could see was just the top of the pot.
The rim. Yeah. Amazing.
And the earth was holding the pressure of the olive oil or the wine, you know.
Amazing. Like the Romans, I guess.
Well, it all comes from there.
Comes from the Romans. Before, when we're chatting, you talked about how you got here and other artists began to come by, visit you, and you started to collaborate with artists on these collaborative commissions. That obviously was a very powerful thing. But can you tell me a bit more so about how actually maybe the landscape, this harsh topography of Heelan, plus also its very quirky history of the gold rush and then those interwar artists, did this have a big impact on the way you thought about your own work? Does it filter through slowly, or is it?
Yeah, it filters through the blood, the skin. I mean, all the shows that I have, they call Healand impressions. And there's impression of like driving from Batos to here and see the landscape on the side of your eyes like this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you gotta have good windows so you can see outside. Not just for light, but to see what's happening outside, you know.
It sort of gets into your, under your skin, literally, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And you're also very interested in food, history of food, and you're a very good cook. We've talked, and actually I helped write a little piece about cooking for you once. And what I really learned from you when we had those discussions was you really don't understand why people want to eat from these big white industrial mass-produced plates when food shouldn't be mass-produced, and food should be more close to the earth, close to the people, close to the humanity. You do domestic wares as well that are very beautiful. I've got some myself in beautiful, well, really they're the colours of the earth. It's your black and brown, wonderful glaze range. Do you think living here in this landscape is what encouraged you to do that kind of new commissions, or was it more coming from the restaurants themselves?
It was kind of a natural progression. One thing that John also said to us, you must have bread and butter line. You can't survive with just making big pots. So our bread and butter line became a tableware, you know. So everybody that comes here must take a plate or something, you know.
Yeah, very hard to resist
And
leaving without one.
And see food on them, you know.
What I like about your wares is they have this kind of weightiness in the hand and beautiful tactility and kind of surface and texture. You know, I did live in this little village twice for a short period, just 5 or 6 weeks, but I was amazed by the impact of the piece on me, myself. Do you feel the spirit of the older artists around you here?
Well, I always call Helen's got a deft energy, which, you know, goes back to the, you know, listening to all those wagons and horses and people screaming and all that sort of stuff.
And all the machinery of the gold mine, the stampers and... Yeah.
I mean, you can imagine across here, there was a battery there. And people used to say when the battery shut down, they couldn't sleep.
They weren't used to the piece.
No.
Yeah, these were the stamping machines that used to crush the gravel to extract some of the gold that ran 24/7. And this is the funny thing about these old, both industrial sites but also gold rush towns, is we find them very peaceful and charming now. But they, as you say, they were full of noise and, in a way, a form of violence, in a way, isn't it? You know, extracting these things from the earth, and then all the noise of the machinery, and there would have been people fighting in the streets.
Everybody was dirty and drunk.
Yes. So it's a bit paradox now, isn't it? When you come to, we arrive at a beautiful avenue of the trees, and we arrive in this peaceful spot, but it's got a very different past. Well, thank you so much, Leno, for letting us come into your life in your studio a little bit today.